We often hear about the gospel of Jesus Christ going to other parts of the earth, to the global south, to the global east. Do we have any reason to hope that Jesus will ever come back and send revival to the West, Western Europe, to America, your family? There is an answer to that, and the answer brings a faith for living.
This is Faith for Living with Dr. Michael Milton, an outreach of Reformed Theological Seminary. Today, Dr. Milton brings a second part of the message, Revival. Here now is Dr. Michael Milton.
God delights in bringing life from death. That's what we've learned in John chapter 4. As we saw a Samaritan woman radically transformed. As we saw Samaria itself break out, at least a city, Sychar, break out in revival. The disciples had given up on it. Not Jesus. Because He always teaches us that God brings life from death. You know, I had to learn that years ago. As a young man, when I went to Kansas. When I left South Louisiana and I moved to Kansas, I couldn't imagine, as I looked out over those expansive fields in that great heartland state, how they could produce more wheat than most countries produce. Because I went there in the winter and it was all frozen. And I said, how in the world can these frozen fields produce golden grains of wheat that will feed the world? I had grown up in South Louisiana. It was a pretty hot climate for most of the time, and which grew a lot of sugar cane and turnips and a lot of other truck crops, but I couldn't imagine how in the world you can feed the world from this frozen field. Until someone told me about the miracle of red winter wheat. Red winter wheat lies under the frozen Kansas soil where it's been cultivated and planted. But then through the miracle of God, there is life under that apparent frozen, dead-looking ground, and there's life in that seed. And that seed is bursting forward, even though all I see is cold and wind and snow and ice. The whole time the seed is coming to life. And the farmer told me, he said, now, Mike, you just watch. In the spring, you're going to see it starting to come up, and it's going to burst forward into the most beautiful field you've ever seen. And there's nothing like it when the Kansas wind blows across it and that golden grain begins to wave. And I want you to think back to this time, this winter, when you asked me that question, how could anything come out of that ground? And you're going to see. Well, sure enough, I did. And I began to understand the cycle, the agricultural cycles of the Midwest and the agricultural cycle of red winter wheat. And I began to understand that underneath the frozen, dead-looking ground, there's life in a seed that will bring forth enough grain to feed the world. That's a spiritual principle that Jesus Christ had to teach His disciples. There's two things I want to talk to you about from John chapter 4, Jesus' trip to Galilee in which He went through Samaria. The two things I want to talk about are cultivating and gathering from a spiritual standpoint. Because I believe what we see in John chapter 4 is God's divine design for bringing revival to desperate disciples. And we've talked about the desperation that we experience in this country, the blight and the bane of sin. What happens when we reject God? We spent a lot of time talking about that and talking about the dry and thirsty land that David talked about as he talked about his own soul and longing for God. And we even saw in Isaiah chapter 33, that the land itself was mourning because of broken covenants and with God and God's people. Not God's broken covenant, but the people's broken covenant with God. And we compared that with our own lives, and we compared that with our own country, and some of the things that we're hearing today, such as, our children are worse off than we are, and this is not the nation that I've known, and could there ever be revival here? I hear about revival in other parts of the world. I felt this inside of my life. Just last year, as I went to Cape Town, South Africa, to represent America in a gathering of about 4,000 or 5,000 Christians from all over the earth, and I would hear about revival going on in South Africa, revival going on in Central Africa, revival going on in East Asia, and the revival going on in other parts. I would even hear how God is stirring in the Middle East. And I would go back to my room and say, "Oh Lord, we don't have any of this. We don't have any of this in our country." I went to school in Wales, and I love Great Britain. We don't have that there. Western Europe is the cradle of Christianity. We don't have that kind of hope in the hearts of our people there. What we have are desperate disciples. But oh, I've got good news. The desperate disciples in John chapter 4 were delighted by the lessons that Jesus showed them. Not only taught them, He showed them. Now, there was a time of cultivating. You remember it says in Isaiah at the end of the segment on the desolation of the land that had come as a result of the faithfulness of the people, that God Himself says, "I will arise." But there is a time of cultivating. And Jesus does this. He goes into Samaria intentionally. Jesus Christ goes into the landscape, the desolation landscapes, the landscapes of blight in our lives intentionally. He comes to you in the midst of divorce. He comes to you in the midst of health problems. He comes to you in the midst of church problems. He comes to you when you feel like you've been hurt and broken by other people. He comes to you. He delights in coming to those places that look like frozen tundras where no life could ever come. Jesus specializes in broken hearts. Jesus Christ specializes in people who have turned from Him. He specializes in bringing life from death. Just the way He did in Kansas in bringing, as I saw, He could bring life from a little red winter wheat seed under the frozen ground. He could bring forth golden grains that could feed people and bring health and joy in life. He does that with nations. He does that with people. He does that with family. He does that with individuals. He'll do that with you. So there's a time in the passage of John 4 of cultivating. And let's see what that cultivating is really all about as we begin to understand God's divine design for revival and how He teaches this to desperate disciples. That divine design for cultivating, first of all, simply begins with Jesus coming. Jesus came to Samaria. It says in the Old King James, he must needs go through Samaria. It was not just a geographical necessity. It was not just a navigational necessity. Jesus needed to go through Samaria because he needed to teach disciples about revival and about salvation. And so Jesus takes this tour through there. And then immediately the disciples, who were spiritually benumbed, the disciples go off to get groceries. In verse 8, they went away into the city to buy food. The whole time Jesus is now focusing on a broken heart and a confused person who was living. You know, in a way, the Samaritan woman at the well is a type of all of the other people of Samaria. You think about it. She, in her conversation with Jesus, brings out a number of things. She brings out the fact that she knew something about God. She knew something, because she lived in Samaria, she knew something about Jacob's well. There were edifices there which talked of a previous generation that knew God. She talked about worship. She tried to even get Jesus into a discussion about worship. Do we worship here, as our Father said, or do we worship over there the way the Jews say? Jesus says in verse 23, the hour is coming, is now here, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship, and God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and truth. And the woman said to him, I know Messiah is coming, who is called the Christ. When He comes, He'll tell us all things. And Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am He. What a revelation! The woman knew certain things about religion. She knew and could even see certain signs that the God, as it were, had been here. It's just like America. You go across the landscape of America, across the landscape of Western Europe. You'll see there in Western Europe great cathedrals which speak of the fact that God was at the center, that people labored and gave their best, their money, their skills, their all, because they had a theological understanding of the centrality of God in their lives. You travel across our country and you'll see quaint little chapels, and you'll see steeples rising up in the middle of towns. You go to New England, and every little New England town you're going to see a beautiful white clapboard church with a magnificent bell which would sound and tell the people that church is started, or make some other announcement, because the church was at the center of the lives of the people. We're kind of like this Samaritan woman. We have a residual understanding, even those now in our society who are not growing up in church. They don't know the hymnody. They don't have the repository of all of the gospel truth maybe that you had in your life. And maybe you're listening today and you're one of those. You didn't grow up in the church. But you're like the Samaritan woman, aren't you? You look across America and you say, something happened here. You look into your history books, and even the most revisionist history books cannot escape the fact of religious freedom. That the founders had a concept of religious freedom, that the founders had a concept of the importance of religion in American life. You can't escape it. And you see, Jesus comes to this place. He comes to places just like this, where there once was a faithfulness. There once was an obedience to a covenantal relationship with God. And by that I mean, as in our own country, those who came and who prayed, God, would you send down your blessing upon us and our children? And we desire to be faithful and to send the gospel out to the ends of the earth. Maybe that was said in your family several generations ago, but now you're no longer following God. Jesus specializes in coming to places like that and people like that, just the way He did here. And during that, you know what happens? The ground, the hard ground, begins to get cultivated. And people like the Samaritan woman begin to awaken. And Jesus, as He comes, says, I am He, I am the one you've been longing for. You know all the literary types which speak of a hero? You know all the literary types which speak of a Christ-like figure, a Superman, if you will? You know the desire in your own heart, the longing in your life, which you can't even explain, that which John Calvin called the sensus divinitatis, the sense of the divine. You know that thing within you that is longing for God, longing for someone, longing for something. Jesus is the one who meets that. I am He, He says. And so the ground is cultivated when these things begin to happen. And oh, it is my prayer, even this day, as this word goes out across our country, into life after life, person after person, family after family, congregation after congregation, you'll begin to see Christ walking among us through His Word. There also needs to be an awakening to see the power of the gospel that is able to change the worst sinner, the power of the gospel that is able to rearrange an entire city. That's what happened at Sychar. The power of the gospel that if we were to follow the trail from Sychar all the way through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and follow through to Pentecost and follow through to church history to see that a whole barbaric civilization, Europe, could be transformed. That Mark would take the gospel to Egypt, that Thomas would take the gospel to India, that the pagan Celts would be transformed and England itself would become a beacon of light, and from there a new world would embrace the gospel, and the gospel would begin to encircle the earth. Wow. Have you been awakened to see the power and the glory of the gospel? When you take that big global work of God and bring it down to your life, your family's life, you can see that God can transform the broken situations in your life. And God can bring life from the frozen tundra landscape of your family into this nation. I had to learn this. I went to Albania. I stood on the head of the crumbled statue of Joseph Stalin in Skanderbeg Square. I speak Albanian because years ago I was in naval intelligence and they trained me to speak Albanian. I was an Albanian spy, as it were. Why Albania? Different story. A little bitty nation sitting on the Adriatic Sea, but it has a deep water port. Paul mentions that port in the end of Romans. It's Durrës, and it's a great submarine launching spot to go into the Adriatic. And so the Navy was interested in Albania for that purpose. So I learned Albanian. At the time, I didn't know why I was learning it, and I wasn't following God. And I remember blasphemy coming out of my mouth as I thought, why in the world am I learning this language? Years later, about 12 years later, I would stand on Joseph Stalin's head, the statue that is, which had been pushed down by the democracy-seeking students. I would stand on the head and I would preach the gospel. A word from another world, ni fialan ni boten theater, from Romans 1:1, the gospel of God. I came back from that experience seeing revival, and I came back on fire. And I told my wife, I think we're going to Albania, because that's where revival is. This is dead. Let someone else fool with this. Because you see, I was on track to go to Kansas, plant a church, You remember the frozen winter fields of Kansas and the harvest coming up? I had had a dream and a vision that maybe God could reach that place by planting new churches there. Oh, but now the revival I saw was in Albania, and that's good. There were people who were to be there. But my wife asked me a question, who has always followed me wherever the Lord has called me. So it wasn't her hesitancy, but it was her penetrating, intuitive, spiritual insight. And she said, "Well, what about America?" I thought that the vision was to reach the very heart of our country. I thought the broken heart of our people needed healing. Who will go there? Well, my wife is generally right. She was right then. As I went to the Lord in prayer, I said, I would rather be with the distraught and the brokenhearted and those who have no hope. There are others who are wanting to go where the revival is. I'll go plow concrete in Kansas. God brought a great harvest. Don't give up on your family. Don't give up on the hard, frozen places of your life. Some of you are university students. You grew up in a Christian family, but increasingly because of divorce and because of a university professor with some golden ideas and the pressure of your peers and the doubt in your heart, you're wondering if it's all true, if the faith of your fathers could really be your faith. Don't give up on believing. Christ comes and opens up and cultivates the hardest ground and then plants the beautiful seeds of life. He said, I am He. I am the one you've been looking for. And when we discover that, when we receive that, as He offers it to you today, everything changes.
Dr. Milton, what can we do and how can we pray for people who have not accepted the faith, who've gone astray, who do not know the Lord?
My heart is greatly moved by your question, because as a pastor, I have had that question come to me in many different forms, many different times. I've had that question in my own heart. I've had to take that question to the Lord. One time I had that question about my own life. I remember asking that question, how can you save me? It doesn't depend on us. If it did, no one would ever be saved. It doesn't depend on how eloquent, compelling, convincing, articulate we are. It depends on the power of the gospel. The power of the gospel has been demonstrated in the person of Jesus Christ, that He is more than able and more than willing to save the one who cries out to Him, and He will create the cry within their heart. I remember a young lady. I buried her father. He committed suicide. And I remember she told me that she had given up on God. And I would tell her for several years, every time I would see her, at the front door of the church when she was forced to come by her mother at Easter and Christmas Eve and times like that, I would say, you know, I refuse to believe that you don't believe. She thought I was crazy. I said, no, I just don't believe in your unbelief. And I didn't. I believed that there were scars, that there was pain, there was heartache. But I believed that the very thing that was hurting her was going to be the thing that God would use to heal her. Because I believed that the cross, which is the instrument of shame and defeat, has become the instrument of glory and victory through Jesus Christ. And I believe in empty tombs. There would come a time when she came to me to say, will you conduct my wedding? And in that time, she also told me, thank you for not giving up on me. I believe. Lord, help my unbelief, but I do believe. I don't understand the pain of my past, but I'm willing to leave it at the foot of the cross. And I've never had a happier wedding I've conducted. I pray that there are many who are listening and watching who have the same question that you have. We'll leave that burden and that question at the foot of the cross and with the Christ who is able to save to the utmost those who are the most lost. And if you think about it, that's all of us. All of us are in need, and none of us could come without Him. So what I would do, what I would say, I would pray. And I'd never nag, though I'd be tempted to, and maybe I have, but I'd rather present and leave it with the Lord. And He'll work on the heart, and He'll do what we can't do.
If you'd like to know more about Dr. Milton and the ministry of Reformed Theological Seminary, visit our website at faithforliving.net. Dr. Milton recently wrote a book called Songs in the Night, focusing on how the gospel can transform our pain into praise. Today we're offering a free chapter taken from that book called The Lord of the Storm. Now, if you'd like to receive your free booklet, call us at 1-800-390-7426 and ask for offer 6-12. Well, thanks for being with us today, and we hope you'll join us again next week as Dr. Michael Milton teaches us how we can have faith for living.